Okay, today's topic is, as usual, clinical clinical approach to diplopia. I will not go into too much of theory part of it. So, as you can see at the bottom right, this is how the diplopia or double vision the patient perceives. So everything looks one over the other or one side by side. So there is a double vision. Now, how do the patients come to us with what complaint? You should know that whatever be their complaint, we should be able to understand that. Some people come and say, Doctor, my vision is blurred. Then some say, I can't see clearly. There is something wrong with my eyes. Then a little more clarity. I see split images. And some more intelligent people say, I see double image. And very few of them will give you a direct diagnosis of diplopia because they say, I see double image, but it becomes single when I close one eye. This very few people tell us. That is what we want to find out in all these situations. What they mean, is it diplopia or not? So please remember, anyone who comes with a complaint of vision problem, we have to clarify that. It is simply remarkable how we have two eyes and yet we see a single image. See, there are two eyes looking at one object, and then in spite of two eyes we see a single image. There is a absolutely marvelous way of neural network in the brain. Now this is because of perfect coordination of eye movements. If the right eye moves to the right and the left eye refuses to move to the right, then obviously there will be diplopia. But throughout our life, when our eyes and other systems are healthy, we have never ever witnessed the double vision. It is because of the perfect coordination. But remember, this coordination is not from the cerebellum, but from the supra and internuclear pathways, that is the upper motor neuron. So this is the most important for conjugate movement of the eyes. Both eyes move in the same direction to the same degree. Even 5-degree difference between the two will cause blurring or double vision. You can yourself check now. If you just lightly press the eyeball, you see everything double. See, that much of mild degree change causes the blurring or double vision. So such a fantastic coordination between the two eyeballs is done by the supra and internuclear pathways. If one eye lags behind, then we get a double vision. So where does one eye lag behind? Now it is simply transforming the information of what we talked about. Patient is unable to walk is due to motor weakness. So eye muscles also have voluntary muscles which move the eyes. So it is something like moving my hand, voluntary. So if the muscles have to work, it can be a lower motor neuron, neuromuscular junction, or a muscle. If I am not able to lift the hand, whether it is a motor weakness due to upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, coming down further, neuromuscular junction, and finally the muscle. The same thing applies to the eye muscles. Light even now when a patient comes to us for blurring of vision, let's say is very vague. Now, first thing we do is close one eye at a time, and if the vision clears, so it is obvious common sense that the patient has diplopia. So that means it is a lower motor neuron paralysis or neuromuscular junction or occasionally muscle disease. If vision is blurred or not seen in the right side of right eye and also the right side of left eye, then it becomes a right hemianopia. The patients will come and say, Doctor, I'm not able to see on the right side. I'm not able to see with the right eye, they will say. They won't be able to see it in the right field. But anybody who comes with a vision complaint, we check these things. Is it a 346 cranial palsy, or is it a hemianopia, which takes the localization to the cerebrum? Or is the vision blurred in only one eye? So if it is only a monoocular problem, either the problem is in the eye, in the media, or neurologically it is in the optic nerve. I think this is the most important first step in our clinical practice when people come to us with blurring of vision. We see in clinical practice patients who have hemianopia, they come to blurring of vision, patients who have optic neuritis, patients who have diplopia. So I think the step one is to check what we are looking at. Now, the ocular muscles, there are 6 sets of ocular muscles: superior inferior rectus, medial lateral rectus, and superior inferior oblique. So there are 6 muscles in the right eye, 6 muscles in the left eye. Plus there are intrinsic muscles which are not under voluntary control. Those are the ciliary muscle for adjusting the size of the lens, distant and near vision, and the pupil, which controls the amount of light that is entering. So if it is very dark, the pupils will dilate so that more light enters for better vision. If it is very bright, it constricts so that less light is damaging. Now let us have a quick look at the ocular movements. So like any movement in the limb, there is an upper motor neuron, there is a lower motor neuron, there is a neuromuscular junction and muscle disease. All of these are involved in the same voluntary activity of the eye muscle. But the upper motor neuron does not cause any problem in the muscle, no stiffness or something like that. The upper motor neuron is essentially for coordinating the eye movements, what is called as a conjugate movements. They move together. When the right eye moves to the right, the left eye also moves to the right in the same degree. And that perfect coordination is done by the supranuclear pathway. That means the nucleus 346, as you know, is in the midbrain and pons. Above the nucleus, right up to the frontal cortex, is called as the supranuclear pathway. Now, this supranuclear pathways has got 2 functions. One is the movement horizontal and vertical. So when I have to look up, both the eyes have to move together up or look down together or horizontally to the right or left. That is the first. The second part of the upper motor neuron function is the speed with which one has to look at. So it is called as a saccades or fast movement or pursuit or a slow movement. So these are the 2 important functions of supranuclear pathway. Now let us go a little bit more interesting facts about this supranuclear pathway. Now what is conjugate gaze? Conjugate gaze is movement of both the eyes in the same direction. That is very important. Now as already told you, it can be in the direction or it can be in the speed. One important clinical point is in supranuclear pathways, there is no diplopia. I mean, it's very simple. Why there's no diplopia? Because supranuclear is concerned with movement of the conjugate gaze. So if supranuclear pathways are affected, the conjugate gaze palsy will be there. But it is not that one eye is not moving with the other properly. Both eyes don't move. If there is a conjugate palsy, both eyes don't move. So there won't be any diplopia because it is not that one eye moves and the other does not move. So the important clinical point is generally there is no diplopia unless there is a involvement of the nucleus also. Now a little more about the saccades. Now saccades and pursuit are very important after looking into the direction. Now why we require saccade? So for example, you are sitting in the class and suddenly a good looking girl enters from the door. So what happens, not only you turn your head, your eyes also go fast and focus on the person. So that moving fast is the saccade. And then what is happening? You just follow as the girl enters the classroom. Now that is a follow movements. It is called as a following movement. You are following the person, or it is also called as a slow movement, or you call pursuit movement. You are pursuing the person. So we require not only saccade to fix the image and also a slow movement to follow the image. And then if the person is going on the stage, so what you do now, you try to look her up from top to bottom, how she has dressed, what she is wearing and all. So that you require a vertical movement. So in the vertical also it can be faster or it can be slower. So you need these movements for the day-to-day living. Now let us see the pathways. The horizontal and saccades starts from the frontal cortex 8. They come down through the midbrain and then they go into the PPRF, that is the Fontaine Center for Horizontal Gaze. So there are two centers for horizontal gaze. One is the frontal and another is the Fontaine. But remember, frontal controls the contralateral because see, look here, it is crossing. Whereas Fontaine is ipsilateral. So horizontal gaze palsy can be due to frontal lobe lesions or it can be due to Fontaine lesions. So the horizontal gaze cortical center is here, which comes down and then ends in the pons. That is the Fontaine center for horizontal gaze. So this is contralateral, which controls, and this is the ipsilateral. Now, because the movement has to take place together, if a person has to look to the right abductor and the left adductor, this is supplied by sixth nerve abduction, the adduction by third nerve. So there has to be a connection between the third and sixth nerve, and that is done by the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The medial longitudinal fascicle connects the third nerve with the sixth nerve and parapontine reticular formation, that is the PPRF. That is how the entire mechanism is such that there is a conjugate horizontal gaze. And the same frontal gaze is meant for saccades. So that is a direction. Now about the speed. The same area of 8 frontal lobe is concerned with the saccades or fast movement. The pareto-occipital is concerned with the slow movement or the pursuit. But again, mark it, the saccades are contralateral control, whereas the pareto-occipital pursuit is a ipsilateral control. So ultimately, they all come down to the PPRF. That is the most important center for movement of the eyes. So this is just to again summarize. The saccades are from the frontal area and the pursuit are from the pareto-occipital cortex. Now the vertical eye movements are in the interstitial nucleus of Cajal in the upper part of the midbrain and a part of the MLF. So the vertical gaze palsies occur because of the brainstem problem. Now, disorders of conjugate gaze is more a clinical observation and less of a patient's problem because isolated conjugate gaze palsies are rare. They're always associated with hemiplegia or Parkinson's disease or olivopontocerebellar atrophy. So some major neurological problem is there. In addition, they also have conjugate gaze palsy. Now, where do you get some disorders of conjugate? Slow saccades are there. That means the fast movement are lost. So when you ask the patient to turn to the right, the patient turns the head first and then the eyes will slowly turn. Because the eyes are not able to quickly turn, there is no saccade. So when you see a patient with a loss of saccades or the fast movement are gone, they try to compensate by violent and quick movement of the head. So the head turns first and then the eyes will slowly turn. Now this happens in Huntington's disease, PSP, especially the vertical eye movements, progressive supranuclear palsy. Commonly used anti-epileptic drugs and sedative drugs shows that they are not smooth pursuit movement. It is a fragmented. It looks like a mild jerky nystagmus. So a horizontal gaze palsy can be due to contralateral frontal lobe or ipsilateral pontine lesion. Now, how do you distinguish whether the patient is unable to look to the right? Is it because of the right pontine or a left frontal lesion? Back to our principles of clinical neurology. Tell me who your friend is. I'll tell you who you are. So if the patient has got other symptoms like hemiparesis and has horizontal gaze palsy, then we know it is a cortical lesion. Similarly, if the patient has seizures or upper motor neuron facial plus conjugate gaze, horizontal gaze palsy, then we know it is cerebral origin. If the patient has a pontine friends, now pontine friends is 5, 6 and 7 cranial nerves. So if any one of those are affected, then you will find that the patient's problem of conjugate gaze palsy is because of the pontine lesion. Neurology is very simple. Horizontal gaze palsy plus this is equal to cerebral plus this is equal to pontine. So you have to look for the friends. Now, vertical gaze palsies, as I said, is based on the two nuclei. One is the interstitial nucleus of Cajal, another is the rostral interstitial nucleus of MLF. Both are in the upper part of the midbrain, which is responsible for vertical gaze. So where do you get vertical gaze palsy? Whenever there is an upper midbrain lesion is there. Very typically we see in patients with progressive supranuclear palsy. Remember, upward gaze restriction is normal as we age. But whatever be our age, we require a downward gaze because we want to see where we are keeping our feet. Otherwise, we'll trip and fall. See how beautifully the nature has structured and contracted everything properly. So we don't have to look up to somebody else because by then we are looking down on somebody else, your children, grandchildren, etc., etc. But to our own safety, we need to look down at the floor. So you will find even in progressive supranuclear palsy, we are not much interested in upward gaze restriction because by the time they are 60, 65, normally also it may be restricted, but it is a downward gaze restriction which is responsible for their frequent falls and injuries. So people are brought saying, doctor, patient is falling very frequently. So when you examine the patient, he has got a downward gaze palsy, plus he has got an axial rigidity. So the two together gives a clinical diagnosis of progressive supranuclear palsy. Now, internuclear ophthalmoplegia, many of you are very much interested because of the examination. So the supranuclear, we said frontal and parieto-occipital. The internuclear is between the nuclei of third and fourth and sixth nerve. That is internuclear, but it is still supranuclear, above the nucleus. So the internuclear is to give connection between the third and sixth nerve so that they also move together. So here internuclear ophthalmoplegia, you know that the adducting eye does not adduct, but the abducting eye has got a nystagmus. So the internuclear ophthalmoplegia, the MLF, connects the third nerve with the sixth nerve nucleus and to the PPRF so that the horizontal gaze, the adductor of the third nerve and the abductor of the sixth nerve, they are together moving so that the patient is able to have a horizontal gaze. So the internuclear pathway. Now, what is 1.5 syndrome? That means one eye is completely paralyzed and the other eye, only the abducting eye has got a nystagmus. Now you'll see that the patient has got this is the MLF lesion. There is no adduction. The abducting eye has got a nystagmus. That is when the patient is looking this side. When a patient is looking this side, there is no movement at all here. So it is called as a one eye completely paralyzed and the other eye is partially affected because there is no adduction and only abducting eye nystagmus is there. So in summary, the supranuclear pathways are of two types. One is from the brain frontal for conjugate horizontal, parieto-occipital for slow eye movements, frontal eye field also for saccades. And then we have internuclear between the third and sixth cranial nerve at the pontine level through the medial longitudinal fascicles. And these supranuclear pathways manifest in terms of conjugate gaze palsy because the purpose is for conjugate movement. So you will not see a single muscle paralysis. So obviously diplopia is not a manifestation. So that is about the upper motor neuron conjugate movements. So now we come to the lower motor neuron. So in the lower motor neuron, like anterior horn cell, anterior root, peripheral nerve. Similarly here, the lower motor neuron is the nucleus of 3, 4, 6 cranial nerves and the cranial nerve itself till it comes and innervates the muscle. Now, as I already told, there are 6 sets of muscles. So we have superior rectus and inferior rectus. Now, inferior oblique and superior rectus together are responsible for directly upward movement. Inferior rectus and superior oblique is responsible for downward movement. The medial rectus and the lateral rectus, you know it well. Now, when the patient has diplopia, sometimes they come and tell, doctor, I have got double vision. I said, which eye? They'll say both eyes double vision. So you ask them to close one eye. They say, yes, there is a double vision. Other eye, also they say there is a double vision. Now, this is not due to paralysis of 3, 4, 6 cranial nerves. So this monoocular diplopia, again, common sense says that it has to be related to the eye, the media. So anything problem with the cornea, iris, lens, vitreous, or sometimes it may be totally functional. The eye specialist has seen everything. He is certified that the media is perfectly clean. And you have seen the patient, that's also perfectly clean. Then you find that the monoocular diplopia, when everything is normal, is probably functional. Now, a genuine monoocular diplopia improves looking through a pinhole. Intraocular problems and refractive problems will definitely cause the improvement through the pinhole because of the lot of rays coming into a particular like a pencil light. Now, if the patient says even that is not able to see, then probably we are dealing with a functional or a malingering problem. Then we use that optokinetic drum nystagmus to further confirm clinically that it is a functional problem. Now we are interested now in the binocular diplopia. So you have to ask them whether binocular diplopia is horizontal, that means something to do with lateral and medial rectus, or is it vertical, so something to do with superior inferior. Is it constant or variable? Very important point for diagnosing neuromuscular junction problem. Is it for near vision or distant vision? Near vision, fourth nerve. The superior oblique muscle is for looking at the book, near vision, or where the two eyes come together as you are going down the staircase. Very typical of fourth nerve paralysis is double vision when you look at the book or double vision when you are going down the staircase. In both the situations, the eye converge. That is the job of the fourth cranial nerve. So near or distant vision is important to know whether we are dealing with fourth nerve or not. And diplopia on looking to which side. If the patient has got double vision to looking to the right, either the right lateral rectus or left medial rectus is affected. Is it the left medial rectus or the right lateral rectus? We have to clinically determine that. So this is the picture which shows you the patient has got 3, 4, 6 cranial nerves. This is the midbrain where the third and fourth is there. This is the pons where the sixth cranial nerve is there. Now you will see here the patient is looking to the right, but the medial rectus is moving here, but not the lateral rectus. So it is a lateral rectus palsy. Here the patient is looking to the left, but the medial rectus is not moving. So it's a right medial rectus palsy. So we'll have to go into the more details, whether it closes, clears with one eye, diplopia is confirmed. Now more important is, where is the split image? They'll say, I see double on the right also as well as on the left. Now you have to find out the maximum split distance is on which side. That is the side where the muscle is paralyzed. So because what happens, some are very clear. I am looking to the left, it is normal. Come to the center, it is normal. When I go to my right, the image starts splitting. So here it is, image starts splitting means this left medial rectus or right lateral rectus is affected. So is it medial rectus problem or lateral rectus problem? You will have to find out which the maximum distance between the split image is on the right or left side. We'll come to that. And then you examine the patient for routine involvement of the optic nerve and see the ocular movements in all directions, one eye at a time, both eyes together for conjugate movement, one eye at a time to see the each muscle and look for ptosis, and most important, look at the pupil, because the characteristic of diabetic third nerve palsy is a painful pupil sparing third nerve paralysis. Very important. Painful pupil sparing third nerve paralysis, because the patient has a headache, that is a pain, and has a third nerve paralysis. But when you look at the pupil, pupil is unaffected, normally reacting, is very characteristic of diabetic third nerve palsy, and you don't require any imaging for that. It is a clinical diagnosis. But if somebody has got headache, vomiting, and has a third nerve paralysis, and you find that pupil is affected, then it is a posterior communicating artery aneurysm. So if the pupil is affected, it becomes the posterior communicating artery aneurysm. So look at the other cranial nerves. Again, this is a very important clinical point. Suppose the patient has orbicularis oculi weakness. In all patients who come to you for sorry, intermittent diplopia, first thing you do is look for the orbicularis oculi. If the orbicularis oculi is very weak, but the rest of the facial nerve is normal, so obviously it is not facial nerve paralysis. So it is something to do beyond the nerve, that is the neuromuscular junction or muscle. So in patients with the myopathies and patients with myasthenia, in addition to diplopia, they have orbicularis oris weakness, orbicularis oculi weakness, sorry. So it is very important in a patient who complains of intermittent diplopia, you think of myasthenia, clinically how to confirm, ask him to shut his eyes tight. You find that it is very weak. But the rest of the face is normal. This combination shows that the disease is not in the nerve, the disease is beyond the nerve, neuromuscular junction or a muscle. Muscle diseases are quite rare, ocular myopathies, whereas myasthenia is relatively common. So you have a clinical diagnosis just by looking at orbicularis oculi in a patient who complains of intermittent diplopia. So beautiful clinical point. I think we'll come back to you because there's still enough time for me in the second half. I hope up till now you are able to understand the flow of thought. Okay, what is this red glass test? As I said, the patient has got complaint of double vision on looking to the right. Okay, that means the right lateral rectus or a left medial rectus is paralyzed. If the patient has left side, other muscles are paralyzed, like patient has a ptosis, the superior rectus, inferior rectus, all are affected as well as the medial rectus, then you don't require red glass. Your own glasses are more than enough to say that the patient has double vision on looking to the right because his left medial rectus is paralyzed because he has a left side ptosis and left upper limb. But there are patients who come to us saying that they have double vision to the right, and when you quickly examine, you don't find any ocular palsy. Just this morning, I saw a patient referred from an eye specialist. Patient complains of double vision, and we don't find anything abnormal. The difference may be so subtle that our eye cannot make out which side is weak, lateral rectus here or medial rectus. There, this red glass comes into the point. So, to continue that, to differentiate which muscle is paralyzed in a situation where the muscle is mildly paralyzed, we want to see which is the image from the right eye, which is the image from the left eye. So we put a color in front of one of the eyes. It may be anything, red, green, or whatever. So when the person looks to the right, he says there are two images, one in the red, another is the normal color. Then you ask him, which is the outermost color? Is it a red or is it a normal color? The outermost image belongs to the paralyzed eye. So that is the idea of finding out which muscle is weaker. So if the color glass is to the right eye and the outermost image is to the right, that means the patient has got either right lateral rectus or left medial rectus paralysis, which you will have to find out with other problems, other findings. Now, this is a patient who came for double vision and went to an ophthalmologist who found there is nothing wrong with the eyes and he referred. Now you see here, the moment you see a patient walking into your OPD with one eye trying to close, that is a double vision. A very important clinical observation. If you ask her why she is closing like that, she says, if I open both eyes, I have a double vision. So these are the people, and she is not able to go to the work because she said that it looks very odd for her to close one eye like that. Then I had to tell her that you can use a glasses and put a patch so that you can see clearly with either eye. One day use a patch here, another day use a patch there, so the double vision will not be there. Now I don't have to go into the details. This fourth cranial nerve supplies the superior oblique muscle, which is concerned with the convergence vision, that is looking down or looking at the book, and the sixth nerve is for the lateral rectus. All other eye muscles are supplied by third nerve. So what are the clinical features? Sixth cranial nerve, diplopia and looking to the lateral side, fourth cranial nerve looking down, and all other movements will be the third cranial nerve. Now the patient has come to us for blurring of vision. We have ruled out other causes, that it is nothing to do with the monoocular problem, it is nothing to do with the hemianopia, and we know it is a third, fourth cranial nerve dysfunction. And we have also ruled out myasthenia because there is no history of intermittent diplopia. Now, anatomical localization is third, fourth, or sixth cranial nerve. But where is that anatomical localization? Now that is the next question, because how you have to investigate further. Like patient has a paraplegia, where is the lesion, thoracic or cervical? So similarly, is it a nuclear or infranuclear, and at what level? Simple, follow the course of nerves and see who the friends are. Now this is the course of nerves. The third and fourth cranial nerve from midbrain, and the sixth cranial nerve from the pons. They all come out of the brainstem and then pass through the base. The third cranial nerve is very close to the posterior communicating artery. So one of the causes of isolated third cranial nerve palsy is a posterior communicating artery aneurysm, which is diagnosed by involvement of pupil as against diabetic third nerve where pupil is normal, it is spare. Then what happens? All the three cranial nerves, they enter the cavernous sinus. So if you find the patient has a combination of 3, 4, 6 and 5th first division, cranial nerve, then you know that you are dealing with a cavernous sinus localization. So your imaging should be on the cavernous sinus. Depending upon the pathology, there is also an internal carotid arteries there. So if the patient may also have a lesion which engulfs the carotid artery, causing the cerebral infarction and hemiplegia on the opposite side. And then the nerves come out, and through the superior orbital fissure, again the structures which are inside is same 3, 4, 5th, 1st and 6th. Same combination 3, 4, 5 and 6 through the superior orbital fissure, and then they enter the orbit. And see here in the orbit, in addition to 3, 4, 5, 1st and 6, there is a second nerve involvement. Clinical neurology is so easy. If the patient has 3rd and 4th cranial nerves with long tract signs, patient has corticospinal, spinothalamic, cerebellar, rubrospinal, all those are affected, then we know that localization for 3rd, 4th or 6th is in the brain stem. So MR scan of the brain stem. If the patient has cavernous sinus, is venous sinus. So if there is an obstruction to the venous sinus, as manifested by chemosis or conjunctival edema and a proptosis plus 3, 4, 5, 1, then you know it is a cavernous sinus. If the patient has a pain behind the eye, the superior orbital fissure syndrome, or what is called as Tolosal syndrome, just pain behind the eye and no venous engorgement, nothing, it is a superior orbital fissure syndrome. If the patient has 3, 4, 5, 6, and when you check the vision, patient has diminished or absent vision, the localization is pakka intraorbital. Clinical neurology is so easy. You just follow the path and find out who are all the friends there. So nuclear lesion is associated with hemiparesis, thalamic, cerebral, cerebellar. Isolated. The isolated cranial nerves are here. Isolated 6th nerve, isolated 3rd nerve. Very rarely you get isolated 4th. Isolated 3rd nerve with pupil intact is a vascular problem, like most often in diabetes. 6th nerve again isolated vascular problem or idiopathy, but these do not require any imaging technique. So this is a chart which has given you the differences. Supranuclear pathways, primary position is neutral, there is no diplopia, pupils are normal, long tract signs are present. Nuclear also long tract signs but with diplopia. Infranuclear, there is a paralysis, strabismus is there, plus diplopia is there. Neuromuscular junction, myasthenia, neutral, there is no squint, occasionally it may be. Definitely diplopia, pupils are obviously not affected. Primary muscle disease, ocular myopathy, there is no diplopia. So if you look into this chart, you will be able to make out where the diplopia is coming from. Nuclear, infranuclear, neuromuscular junction, or a muscle. Now, cavernous sinus thrombosis, I already told you, 3, 4, 5, 1st division and 6. Patient will have chemosis because of venous obstruction. There is a dilated pupil because 3rd nerve is completely affected. And because of the venous obstruction, the eyeball is pushed forwards, that is the proptosis. The common causes are infective or thrombosis or occasionally aneurysm of internal carotid artery. Remember, internal carotid artery is one of the structures within that. Occasionally, it can be due to sudden onset of proptosis, pulsating ophthalmal, exophthalmos. It is a carotid cavernous fistula because the pulsation is transmitted from the high pressure carotid artery. Intraorbital localization is second nerve. Common causes are pseudotumor or a granuloma or an abscess. Now, causes of isolated cranial nerve 3rd palsy, most often if it is isolated, diabetic, we say diabetic, otherwise we just say we do not know. But important is that we don't have to do any imaging if it is an isolated 3rd nerve. They all recover well within a matter of 3 months. If pupil is affected, you must investigate. Isolated sixth nerve, most often again idiopathic. Always check for eighth nerve and seventh nerve. The acoustic neuroma is a combination of 6, 7, and 8. So check for seventh nerve, eighth nerve. If you find seventh nerve, eighth nerve are normal and isolated sixth, then you don't have to do any imaging. In all other conditions, there are other clinical symptoms to tell you that you are not dealing with isolated one. Now, a couple of cases: a diabetic 5 years, pain left forehead 10 days, drooping up left eyelid 1 week. On examination, there is a total third nerve palsy, sparing the pupil. Now, this is a diabetic third nerve palsy. I give a short course of steroids, say about 40 milligrams per day for 10 days with a good control of diabetes, and they almost always recover completely in about 4 to 6 weeks. Now, this is a patient with a ptosis, and when you lift the eyelid, patient had a total third nerve palsy. Now, as against that, again a diabetic, but he had a severe headache and vomiting because the aneurysm has bled. So the patient had meningeal irritation due to small subarachnoid bleed. And so patient had a headache, vomiting, followed by double vision, and patient had a third cranial nerve palsy. Now investigation showed it is a posterior communicating artery aneurysm. So you see that pupil is fully dilated here. The abduction is possible. The adduction is not possible. See, he is looking to his left. Left lateral rectus is good, but the right medial rectus is not working. So obviously here, with a pupil dilated, you don't need a red glass test to find out which muscle is weak. Now another situation, a right retroorbital pain. That means there's something wrong with the orbit or superior orbital fissure. With a proptosis, that means there's something in the intraorbital which is pushing the eyeball, or cavernous sinus with a lot of venous congestion. So if you find a venous cavernous sinus, there's a lot of chemosis and a proptosis. That means a venous obstruction. A simple proptosis without chemosis, it is intraorbital. Now this patient was investigated for thyroid disorder, and second nerve was intact in this patient. Now this is a what is called as a pseudo tumor myositis. So only the muscles, you see here, the muscles are completely thick muscle is here as compared to the thin muscle here. So this is a muscle inflammation which has caused pushing of this. There is no space occupying lesion because the second nerve is intact. So the orbital inflammatory disease, one is a Tolosa-Hunt or a painful ophthalmoplegia. Another is what I showed you, the orbital pseudotumor. Tolosa-Hunt syndrome, instead of remembering that, remember the descriptive terminology, superior orbital fissure syndrome. So the pathology is in the superior orbital fissure, where all the three cranial nerves with fifth one is entering the orbit. There is an inflammation of the superior orbital fissure. Because of the inflammation, there is a pain, and also because of the first division, there is a pain in the division of first division of the fifth cranial nerve. It is called as a painful ophthalmoplegia. So they have painful eye, ocular palsy, non-specific inflammation. Now, dramatic relief with steroids, our Ganga gel. Now the Ganga is much more cleaner. So there is a dramatic relief with high dose of steroids of 1 mg per kg body weight. Within 48 hours, the pain disappears and then the eye movement starts. Of course, you do an imaging here to rule out any other intra-orbital space occupying lesion. Once you know that there is no other space occupying lesion, you are sure of the diagnosis. Now in clinical practice, very commonly we see isolated third and isolated sixth. Carefully examine other cranial nerves, the friends of cranial nerves. Suppose sixth is there, you examine seventh and eighth. If third is there, you look for the pupil and long tract signs. If none of them are there, they don't require imaging because they are all isolated cranial nerve as they are coursing through the base of the skull. So most of the common cause is a ischemic cranial neuropathy, and a good dose of steroids is what they require. In addition to the steroids, we tell them to put a patch on the eye to prevent double vision, and they can carry on with their activities. After all, we require only one eye to live and only one kidney to live. But the patients are not aware of this. As I showed you, the elderly lady who used to close her eye like this. So imagine a front desk secretary, young girl, closing eye like this and trying to deal with the people there. It gives a very wrong impression. So best thing is to put a patch for the glasses. Some people don't want a patch because it invites comments. So there is a small lens here at the center which cannot be seen by others to obstruct your vision. So that can also be used, the stick-on occlusive lens. Now we finally come to the other two causes of diplopia. Very rarely ocular myopathy. Myasthenia, yes, one should be aware of. I've already talked to you about myasthenia. Asthenia is weakness of the muscle. So when the muscles are kept on lot of work, it becomes weak, and so there is a diplopia is there. So intermittent diplopia, fatigability, frustrated by exercise, improved by tensilon or neostigmine. So you can do an EMG and AChR antibody, but remember, pure ocular involvement without ptosis. You can't put a needle into the medial rectus or lateral rectus. So you only put a needle into the superior orbital, levator, not even levator papillation. You can only put it in the facial muscles around. Most often the facial muscles are affected in myasthenia, the orbicularis oculi. So you can do that EMG, but EMG is normal, does not mean ocular myasthenia is excluded, because you are not putting a needle in the muscle which is weak. Clinical diagnosis. And AChR antibody, MuSK antibody is present in about 80%, but may not be present in the others. So back to clinical diagnosis. Ocular myopathy is a very rare condition, but myopathy is a degenerative disease, so bilaterally symmetrical. So the muscles are bilaterally symmetrically affected. So the conjugate movements are slowed down, but they are not discordant. So generally, in ocular myopathy, there is no diplopia. Supranuclear, no diplopia. Myopathy, no diplopia. So this is very important. You will find that there are two types of oculocraniosomatic syndrome, what is called Kearns-Sayre syndrome. You may be more interested. And the histopathology is a ragged muscle fibers. You may be more interested because you want to pass the examination, but these are of no use for clinical diagnosis. If you miss these, it doesn't matter. But if you miss myasthenia, it definitely matters. So similarly, other oculopharyngeal muscular dystrophy, the histopathology is a different one, rim vacuoles. I think a quick go through the ptosis. Some people come only for ptosis. Now this table gives you the full picture. All these tables are there very much in my book, Clinical Neurology Made Easy. You need not bother about looking at it very carefully here, but please understand it. So the levator palpebrae superioris is a small muscle there, which is supplied by parasympathetic, sympathetic, neuromuscular junction, and muscle. All the four can affect. Now, how to differentiate? Again, look for associated friends. If it is a parasympathetic like third nerve, pupil is dilated. Horner syndrome, it is constricted. NMJ and muscle, of course, pupil is not affected. Ocular palsy, parasympathetic. Yeah, in addition to pupil, there may be, in addition to ptosis, there may be medial rectus, inferior rectus, and all that. But if it is a sympathetic, absolutely no. Neuromuscular junction, yes. Myopathy, yes. Diplopia, parasympathetic, yes. Sympathetic is obviously not, because other ocular pulses are not there. Neuromuscular junction, fluctuating. This is absent here. What is important is in ptosis, always it is partial and unilateral. In Horner syndrome, because the muscle, the sympathetic fibers which supplies the muscle, is a very small muscle with little function to lift the eyelid. The main function to lift the eyelid is the levator palpebral superioris by third nerve. So third nerve can give rise to total paralysis of ptosis, but not sympathetic. So if you find somebody with a partial ptosis, is it partial parasympathetic or partial sympathetic? If you find somebody with a total ptosis, don't think of sympathetic at all. So this is how you differentiate one from the other. Then we come to the pupils. The reason why the pupil dilates and constricts is to see that the light is neither too bright or too dark. So in the dark, the pupil dilates to have more amount of light coming in for vision. In the bright light, it is constricts. This afferent pupil defect, which you always do it in the clinical practice, the afferent is the one which convey the light pathway, but the efferent is for both the pupils. So you shine a light in one eye, both the eyes will constrict because the efferent goes to both through the posterior commissure. The efferent goes to both the pupillar constrictor fibers, but the optic nerve one side and both pupil constricts. So if suppose there is an optic nerve pathology, obviously the ipsilateral eye where you have put the light doesn't constrict immediately, but the other eye constricts because it is normal. And then as it is dilating, now this also is in a dilated stage. So that's why when you put a light, instead of constriction, you find that the patient has got a dilatation. That is what is called as, it only means there is a optic nerve dysfunction. There is nothing more great about it. Optic nerve dysfunction. That's why there is no immediate constriction of the pupil. That's all. There is nothing great about that. I don't think I will spend a lot of time in this because they are all theory. Addis pupil, Argyll Robertson pupil, and all that, which you are more experts in these things than me. This is always it is a asymptomatic, just incidentally detected. Patient may have photophobia in addition to the tonic pupil because the ciliary muscle and iris is affected. The cause is a post-ganglionic parasympathetic denervation. The ciliary ganglion, after that is a parasympathetic. So the denervation of these ciliary muscles and iris. So the patient has constriction poorly to light, but the accommodation reflex is a different pathway altogether. So the accommodation reflex is better. Horner syndrome, just now I told you about the sympathetic chain which is affected. Meiosis because of the pupil small, irregular, unequal pupils, partial ptosis. Remember this, partial ptosis and anhidrosis. Most often we don't know where the pathology is. It doesn't really make a difference. We always look for the friends, whether it is associated with stroke or a lung tumor or a spinal cord injury. And then we say, okay, Horner syndrome is because of this or because of this or because of this. Nobody comes to us for Horner syndrome per se isolated. If they come isolated, you better start looking for intrathoracic pathology. Nystagmus, somebody wanted nystagmus. Just quickly, there are two types of nystagmus. Commonest is a jerk nystagmus. Then pendular nystagmus usually occurs when loss of vision in early life. Jerk nystagmus is there is a slow movement with a quick correction. That quick correction, which side is goes? If it is going to the right side, we say nystagmus is on to the right. So the direction is on the fast component. It can be horizontal, vertical, or rotatory. Nystagmoid. Now, many of us, if you try to look at the extreme right, there will be a few jerky movements. That is called as a nystagmoid movement. It is not nystagmus. So how laterally one should go? You should go laterally till this corneal margin touches the medial canthus. Beyond this, if you go, there will be some jerks. So how much to go? If he is going to the right, observe the left eye. The cornea touches the medial canthus here. Don't go beyond that. You just stop there. At that point, if you see the jerky movements, then it is called as a nystagmus. It has got a jerky movement. So it has got two types of nystagmus is there. Is it a vestibular or is it a central? It is a vestibular nucleus involvement in the center or it is in the labyrinth. That is what is most important clinically. How to differentiate the two. I think this slide will give you everything. Peripheral nystagmus is a short one. Central, there is a latency of typically benign positional vertigo. You go and see the patient turns, you know, I doctor, oh, I got vertigo. After 5 seconds, you will find the patient has vertigo and a jerky nystagmus. Central nystagmus, there is no latency. Associated symptoms of peripheral, labyrinthine, vertigo, vomiting, which are short-lived. There is no vertigo and vomiting, but there is a infrequent vomiting. Unidirectional. Now, this is important. Peripheral nystagmus is only one side. Whether you look to the right or to the left, the quick component is always to the right. Whereas in central, if you look to the right, there is a right side nystagmus. If you look to the right, there is a left side nystagmus. So it is a gaze evoked and changes the direction. Now, the duration, visual fixation gets suppressed. Now, in case of peripheral, if you suppress their vision, now you have to use a Frenzel's glasses and all, but in clinical practice, what you do is you look at the fundus. So when you are looking into the fundus of the patient, his vision is blocked. So that gives rise to, so once the vision is blocked, then it gets suppressed. The nystagmus gets suppressed. It is not suppressed in the center. So I think this one, you just go through the chart. This is more than enough for you to differentiate a central from a peripheral. That means, is it a brain stem vestibular nuclei or is it in the ear? Now, lastly, optokinetic nystagmus, as I told you, patient who complain of uniocular diplopia, uniocular blurring of vision. You don't find anything. You think it is probably functional. So one of the clinical methods is to use this alternate black and white strips. So this black and white strip in a tape also, you can move like this in front of the patient, or you can have a drum and ask him to see. He will say, sir, I am blind, I can't see. I said, I know you are blind, but you just keep gazing straight. That's all. I know you don't know it, you don't see it, but just keep gazing straight. So when he's gazing straight on the drum, then you will find that there is a nystagmus. That means there is a vision, even though the patient is denying. Of course, we have electrophysiological methods of VER, visual evoked responses, to say that. Now, last time somebody was asking me which book to read for clinical neurology. I would still recommend my book. My book is a basic. It is like teaching you alphabet ABCD. Once you know the ABCD, you can make a word or even a sentence after going through this Harrison's Neurology in Clinical Medicine. What I have is a third edition. I'm sure the newer editions has come. So this will be a very good book for you to help you in your clinical neurology.